At sundown, a lone cowboy found a boy crouched in the dust, ribs showing through his skin, eyes hollow with hunger. Without a word, he shared the last of his bread and water, thinking it was a small kindness that would vanish with the night. But when the sun rose, thunder rolled not from the sky, but from the earth itself. 400 riders surrounded his ranch, their horses snorting, their rifles glinting. What began as a quiet act of mercy had become a spark that would draw an army to his door, and decide whether the frontier remembered him as savior or traitor. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The dawn crept slow and pale across the horizon, spilling its light over the dry plains until every shadow stretched long and sharp, and when the cowboy stepped onto his porch, boots grinding against the warped boards, rifle resting loose but ready in his hand, he saw the riders stretched across the land like a living wall, 400 strong, their horses stamping restless, breath pluming into the morning air, rifles and lances glinting where the first sun caught them, and in that vast silence the world seemed to hold its breath. He had risen expecting nothing more than the ordinary weight of another day chores in the barn, the slow tending of a worn ranch that had never given him much, but had always been his. But instead he found himself staring at an army, the earth itself trembling faintly beneath their sheer number, the sight both magnificent and terrifying. For never had he seen such a host gathered, not even in the border skirmishes of his youth. And here they were, unmoving, watching, the wind carrying no war cries, no threats, only the thick silence of judgment. His mouth felt dry, though the morning air was crisp, and he forced his shoulders straight, knowing any sign of fear would be read by 400 pairs of eyes that missed nothing. The boy he had found crouched in the dust the night before still lay wrapped in a blanket behind him, stirring faintly with the weak movements of hunger and exhaustion, unaware that his presence had drawn the thunder of hooves to this quiet patch of land. And the cowboy's mind twisted with disbelief. How could a crust of bread and a swallow of water have summoned this? Yet the evidence stood before him, an unyielding sea of riders, painted faces stark against the dawn, their silence more terrible than any shouted demand. He shifted his grip on the rifle, not raising it, only letting its weight steady him, for he knew well enough that even the sharpest shot in the territory could not fell an army, and one wrong move would mean more than his death. It would mean fire sweeping across his ranch, across the plains, perhaps across the settlements beyond, for 400 armed men did not gather without cause, and the cause now rested squarely in his hands. He tried to read their faces, but they gave nothing away, their stillness deliberate, their silence a weapon sharper than steel, and he felt the weight of their expectation pressing against his chest until it was hard to draw breath. The porch boards creaked as he shifted his stance, every sound magnified in the stillness, and he thought of the bread he had shared. The boy's hollow eyes widening as crumbs touched his lips, the faint gratitude too weak to be spoken. And it struck him that mercy, something he had considered small, forgettable, had become the hinge of fate itself, the difference between war and peace, between his life and the ruin of all he had built. The riders did not move, did not speak, only waited, and he realized with a chill that the dawn was no longer his, no longer the ordinary sunrise of another day, but a reckoning, and every second he delayed, every breath he took, was being measured by 400 eyes, 400 rifles, 400 hearts deciding whether his kindness marked him as friend or as traitor. The cowboy's gaze swept across the endless sea of riders, his gut twisting tighter with each painted face that stared back at him, until at last, near the front where the line curved like a crescent of steel and flesh, he saw him, the boy he had fed just hours before, no longer a half-starved scrap crouched in the dust but seated high upon a painted pony, small hands gripping the reins with a steadiness that belied his size, shoulders squared as though the blanket that had barely covered his bones last night had been traded for armor. The transformation made the cowboy's breath catch, for the child's hollow eyes, once shadows of hunger, now burned with a fire he could not name. Not gratitude exactly, not accusation either, but something deeper, a weight of meaning that bound them both in a silence that seemed to stretch across the plain like a rope pulled taut. The boy did not look away, and in that unwavering gaze the cowboy felt the spark of recognition, A truth unspoken but undeniable that what he had done had not been small, had not vanished with the night, but had been seen, carried, magnified, until it stood now, as the reason 400 men sat astride their horses, waiting for his next breath. The boy, so frail he had seemed barely able to stand, sat proudly now, the painted pony shifting beneath him but never unseating him, as if the animal itself recognized the boy's claim to this moment, and the warriors beside him treated him not as burden but as sign, their faces turned toward the cowboy as though awaiting his understanding of the meaning they already shared. The cowboy's rifle felt heavier in his hand, useless against this tide of destiny. For what weapon could he wield when the choice before him was not one of bullets but of faith, of whether mercy could stand as bridge between two worlds that had known only blood? His throat tightened as the memory of the boy's voice returned to him, faint and rasping as he had eaten crumbs from the cowboy's hand, a sound too weak to form words, yet now those same lips held firm. That same gaze carried the weight of an entire people's judgment, and the cowboy realized with a jolt that the boy was not simply a rescued child but a messenger, a living bond between his mercy and their might. The silence deepened, the horses stamping as if impatient, the morning air sharp with the scent of leather and dust, and still the boy stared, his dark eyes unblinking, daring the cowboy to understand, to step into the role he had unknowingly claimed with his act of kindness. It was mercy that had placed bread in the boy's hands, but it was consequence that now sat astride that pony, watching him with the steadiness of one who bore not just his own fate but the fate of hundreds. And the cowboy knew, with a heaviness that settled deep in his bones, that the riders had not come for war. Not yet. They had come because of him, because of the boy, because of the fragile, dangerous bridge that bound their lives together. And what he did next would decide whether that bridge carried them all to peace or collapsed into blood. From the stillness of the sea of riders, one figure eased his horse forward, the sound of hooves deliberate, slow, carrying the weight of years heavier than any drumbeat. And as the cowboy's eyes fixed on him, he knew instinctively that this was no ordinary warrior but an elder whose presence alone commanded silence more profound than fear. His face, weathered and lined, bore the deep furrows of griefs endured and battles survived, the kind of losses that did not break a man but carved him into stone, and though his rifle remained slung at his back and his hands rested loosely on the reins, no drawn weapon was needed, for the authority radiating from him struck sharper than any blade. The painted pony bearing the boy stepped aside almost reverently as the elder came forward, the younger riders watching him with a mixture of respect and expectation, as though his voice alone could determine whether the morning sun rose over peace or bloodshed. The cowboy shifted slightly on the porch, rifle heavy in his hand, but he did not raise it. Some instinct deeper than fear told him that to move against this man would not only bring his own death but would close forever whatever fragile bridge had been strung between them. As the elder halted his horse within a few paces of the porch, the silence grew so thick the cowboy could hear the animal's breath steaming in the cold dawn, could hear the faint groan of the boards beneath his boots, and for the first time in years he felt himself not as master of his own land but as a lone soul standing at the edge of something vast and ancient, his fate dangling by a single breath. The elder's eyes, dark and sharp beneath the paint, streaked across his cheeks, locked with his, and in them the cowboy saw no hatred, no simple hunger for vengeance, but something more terrible: judgment, the weighing of his heart, the testing of whether the mercy shown to one starving child was an accident of pity, or the measure of the man himself. The boy sat straighter in his saddle, gaze flicking between them as though he too knew the moment balanced on a knife's edge, his small frame carrying the unspoken question of whether this stranger would stand firm or falter. The cowboy swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat thick as dust, every instinct urging him to speak, to defend himself, to explain. But the elder had yet to utter a word, and in that silence the cowboy understood that speech alone would not save him. What mattered was the weight of his stance, the steadiness of his gaze, the truth written in the tremor or stillness of his hands. So he tightened his grip on the rifle, not in defiance but to steady himself, to remind his shaking bones of strength. And he lifted his chin, refusing to look away, even as the air between them seemed to tilt like a scale, one side holding war and ruin, the other holding a fragile, impossible peace. And he knew that the elder, with nothing more than a gesture or a single word, could tip that balance forever. The elder finally spoke, his voice low and resonant, carrying across the still morning air like the roll of distant thunder, and though the cowboy could not understand every word, the weight behind them was undeniable, the sharpness in the cadence cutting like a blade. And when the elder lifted his hand, gesturing first to the boy upon the painted pony and then toward the cowboy himself, the meaning fell into place with terrible clarity. What he had done, in offering bread and water, had not been taken as a simple kindness, a passing act of mercy in the dark, but as something far greater, far binding, as if by feeding the child he had laid a claim, forged a bond that demanded recognition and consequence. The cowboy's heart thudded heavy as the elder's hand lingered between them, the riders shifting faintly in their saddles, murmurs rising like wind through tall grass, their painted faces turned toward him with expectation, not of apology, not of denial, but of reckoning, as though his choice had already been made and now they waited only to see if he understood the depth of it. He felt his stomach knot. For all his life he had thought of mercy as a small thing, a gesture that began and ended in the giving. But here it was no longer his to define. Here it had become a thread woven into their law, their belief, their way of binding one life to another. And in their silence, in the boy's steady gaze, in the elder's unyielding posture, he felt the truth. He was no longer standing as a man alone on his porch, but as one who had entered into a covenant he did not know existed. A covenant that now bound not just him but the fate of his ranch, perhaps the town beyond. The rifle in his hand suddenly seemed foolish, its weight an echo of a world that had no place in this moment, for no bullet could undo the claim already spoken into existence by bread broken and water shared. His mind raced, searching for words, for explanations, for some way to cast his act as chance or mistake, but the elder's eyes burned through him, steady and immovable, and he understood that denial would not be heard as innocence but as betrayal, that to retreat now would be to spit on the very bond they had come to honor. And the rider's stillness, their sheer immovable waiting, told him that betrayal would not be met with silence, it would be met with fire. Sweat traced down his back beneath the cool morning air as he realized that a single night's compassion had not only pulled a starving child from the dust, but had also chained him to a people who demanded more than pity, who demanded recognition of kinship, loyalty, responsibility, and he was left standing on his porch with his empire of dust and cattle behind him, staring into the eyes of an elder who carried the weight of centuries, feeling the world tilt beneath him as his future hung on whether he embraced the bond he had unknowingly forged or rejected it, and in so doing, unleashed the storm that waited, 400 strong, for his answer. When the cowboy rode into town, dust clinging to his boots and his mind still heavy with the memory of the elder's gaze, he found the air thick, not with the usual murmur of saloon doors and horses' hooves, but with whispers that slithered like snakes from porch to porch, faces turning quickly away when his shadow fell across them, conversations clipped mid-sentence, eyes sharp with the weight of something unsaid, and though no one dared confront him openly, the truth hung in the space between them. Word of what had happened on his porch had traveled faster than the wind, carrying with it both fear and judgment. It wasn't long before the sheriff found him, leaning casual against the hitching post outside his office, a man whose badge shone brighter than his conscience, whose belly spoke of indulgence fattened by the very wealth that had broken so many men, and when he pushed off the post to approach, his smile was slow, sharp, the kind that showed no warmth, only calculation. "You've lit a fire you can't put out," he muttered, voice pitched low enough that only the cowboy could hear, yet loud enough for the men gathered nearby to catch the edge of menace in it. And behind the casual words was the iron weight of threat, a reminder that the law in this county was not written in books or carried by juries, but carried in the pockets of those who paid the sheriff's price. The cowboy stood silent, letting the words settle, knowing that to answer rashly would only feed the fire. But his silence did not soften the sheriff, whose eyes gleamed with something darker than simple warning. It was hunger, profit gleaming just beneath the surface, the kind of opportunism that thrived in storm and ruin. 400 riders, the sheriff went on, spitting the number like a curse. And they're not here for me, or for the town, or for cattle, they're here for you. You gave bread to a boy, but what they saw was a claim, a bond, and bonds like that don't break easy. You've dragged us all into it, cowboy. And someone's going to pay. His voice lingered on that last word, curling around it like smoke, and though he stepped back as if the conversation was finished, his eyes never left the cowboy's, weighing him, measuring how deep his pockets ran, already calculating how best to profit from the chaos looming at the horizon. The townsfolk, too, measured him as he walked away, their whispers trailing after him like thorns, some voices sharp with blame, others hushed with fear, but none offering comfort, none offering solidarity, and in that moment he felt more alone than he ever had on his ranch, surrounded by silence. For now he carried not only the eyes of the riders in the hills, but the judgment of a town that wanted nothing to do with a fire they feared might burn them all. And as he passed back through the saloon's swinging doors, the murmur of conversation dying once more at his presence, he felt the truth of the sheriff's words pressing down like a noose the fire had already caught, and no water on earth would put it out. The barn was quiet save for the soft shifting of cattle and the occasional creak of wood settling in the night, but inside his chest there was no quiet, only the storm of doubt and memory clashing like steel, and as the cowboy leaned against the rough beam with the rifle laid aside, sweat cold on his temples despite the chill, he asked himself whether the bread he had given was an act of mercy or a mistake that would bring ruin to everything he had built. The shadows of the rafters seemed to bend with his thoughts, carrying him back to the nights of his own youth when he had known the gnaw of hunger in his belly so sharp it kept him awake, when he had crouched beneath the stars with ribs pressing against skin, praying for scraps that never came until one night a stranger face he could no longer picture. Only the hand, rough and calloused, had offered him a piece of dried meat and a water skin, a gesture so small the man himself probably forgot it by dawn. But to the boy he had been it was salvation, a memory that had never left, a reminder that survival itself often hung by a thread of kindness. Now he wondered if that thread had wound itself through time and pulled taut on his own hand when he passed bread to the starving boy in the dust, if the act had been less his own choice and more the echo of a mercy given long ago. And yet what terrified him was not the memory but the weight of its consequence, for where the stranger had walked on without burden, his own act had summoned an army, 400 strong, waiting like judgment at his gates. Dread clawed at him, whispering that he should never have stopped, never have looked twice, that had he ridden past the child would have withered unnoticed, and his ranch would still be quiet, his cattle still his only concern. But another voice rose in him, quieter but stronger, saying that perhaps this was not ruin but calling, that maybe mercy, when given, demanded a price, and he was only now realizing its true cost. He gripped the beam hard, knuckles white, torn between fear of what was coming and the ghost of gratitude he had once carried as a starving boy himself, the memory of salvation against the certainty of danger. And it struck him that no matter how much he wanted to turn away, the bond had been forged the moment he reached down into the dust, and turning back now would be more betrayal than survival. The cattle lowed softly, shifting as though they too felt the weight pressing in from the horizon, and in that sound he felt the fragile thread of his past and present tying together the boy he had been, the boy he had saved, and the man he must decide to become, all of it pressing against him in the dark of the barn, until he knew with a clarity that terrified him more than silence or threat. This was no accident, no mistake. It was a fire lit by mercy, and he had to choose whether to let it consume him or to walk into it and carry its heat. Night draped itself heavy over the plains, and with it came the low thrum of drums, steady as a heartbeat that was not his own, carrying through the darkness until it seemed to seep into the very bones of the ranch. Each pulse, a reminder that 400 riders waited just beyond the fence, their campfires scattered like stars fallen to earth, sparks rising into the black sky where no wind dared stir. The cowboy stood in the shadows of his porch, watching the flicker of those flames paint the horizon with orange and red, casting long shapes of men and horses against the dark, their movements strange, deliberate, like rituals older than the land itself. And though no voice carried high, no threat was shouted, the silence between the drumbeats was thicker than war, a silence that spoke of patience, of a reckoning not yet past but inevitable. The cattle huddled restless in their pens, ears flicking at the alien sounds, while the cowboy's hands itched toward his rifle, though he knew full well that no bullet could scatter 400 hearts united by cause, and he felt that same dread coil in his gut even as something else, a strange pull. A curiosity kept his eyes on the firelight, on the dance of shadows that seemed to whisper meaning beyond words. Then, as he turned from the horizon, a movement at the fence caught his eye, small and furtive, and he tensed until the firelight shifted enough to reveal the outline of the boy, the same child he had fed crouching once more in the dust, though now he carried himself with a quiet determination that unsettled the cowboy more than the drums. The boy crept close, glancing back toward the camp where the elders sat in council, then slipped through the posts of the fence, and in his hands was something small, gleaming faintly in the dim light, a carved token, shaped from bone or wood, smooth from care, etched with lines the cowboy could not decipher. The child pressed it into the earth at the base of the fence line, eyes never leaving the cowboy's, gaze steady, not pleading this time but offering, as though entrusting him with something sacred. And in that unspoken gesture the cowboy felt his breath catch, for it was not simply gratitude, it was covenant, a symbol of recognition, perhaps even belonging, and he realized with a shiver that his act of mercy had not only been seen but sanctified, carried from the hunger of one child into the traditions of an entire people. The boy's small hand lingered on the token, patting it once into the dirt, then he backed away silently, slipping again into the firelit night where the shadows swallowed him whole, leaving behind only the faint gleam of the carved piece and the steady beat of the drums, which now seemed less a threat and more a summons, as though the fire itself was calling him to step beyond his fence and decide if he was willing to claim the bond that had been laid before him. The cowboy stood motionless, heart hammering in his chest, staring down at the token until the meaning of the night pressed fully into him. He was no longer a man standing alone on his porch, but the keeper of a flame passed from one life to another. And whether he wished it or not, the frontier would remember his choice. When the dawn came again, it was not with the quiet stillness of ordinary mornings, but with the heavy tread of footsteps approaching across the dew-damp grass. The elder himself riding forward from the vast camp beyond the fence, his horse moving slow and steady as if even the animal understood the gravity of what must be spoken, and the cowboy stood stiff by the gate, rifle at his side though his hand no longer rested on it, for he knew that no bullet could change the truth about to be laid before him. The elder halted within speaking distance, his weathered face carved with the sorrow of losses that seemed older than the hills, and when he raised his hand in greeting, the murmurs of the riders behind him hushed like wind dying across the plains, until the silence was broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the faint stamp of hooves. Then came the words, heavy and deliberate, carried in a voice that seemed to draw strength from the very earth, a tongue the cowboy barely grasped but made clear by gesture and tone, and with each phrase the weight of the truth pressed deeper into him. The child he had fed was no ordinary boy, not some wanderer lost in the dust, but the last son of a fallen chief whose name still carried the echo of thunder across the tribes, a lineage steeped in blood, loyalty, and reverence. And by saving him, by offering bread and water when none else would, the cowboy had unknowingly stepped into the heart of an ancient law, had been marked not as passerby but as chosen, bound to the boy's survival, bound to the people who now looked upon him not as enemy nor stranger but as bridge, a living line between their grief and the world of settlers that pressed harder against their borders with each season. The elder's eyes bore into his, dark and unflinching, and in them the cowboy saw not threat but expectation, the kind that made his chest ache with the enormity of it, for he had thought himself a simple man, land and cattle his only burdens. Yet now he stood in the place of a leader, a mediator between two worlds sharpened against each other like knives, and the thought of it filled him with dread so fierce he could scarcely breathe. The boy sat once more on his painted pony at the elder's side, small chin lifted proudly though the shadow of hunger still lingered in his cheeks, and when his gaze met the cowboy's, the meaning was clear without need of words. You are bound to me, and I to you, by bread, by water, by mercy, by fate. Behind them, the drums began again, low and steady, not warlike but solemn, and the riders watched with eyes that measured his every twitch, waiting to see if he would embrace the role thrust upon him or recoil, and in so doing cast the boy's salvation into betrayal, a spark that would turn their patience into fire. The cowboy's throat tightened, his mind flashing to his own youth. To the night a stranger had saved him with a scrap of food and a drink of water, a debt he had never repaid. And he felt the cruel symmetry of it pressing down now, destiny circling back in the form of a starving boy, and 400 riders demanding not his coin nor his cattle, but his courage. And as the elder's words faded into the morning air, the truth settled over him like a mantle of stone. Mercy had chosen him, and whether he wished it or not, the frontier itself now waited to see if he would stand between its fury and its hope. The night pressed down heavy, a sky full of stars spilling their cold light across the ranch, every fence post casting long, skeletal shadows as the cowboy paced the dry earth with his boots grinding grit beneath each step, his breath rising in the chill as though even the air resisted giving him ease. For no matter how far he walked, the boundaries of his land, no answer came to him, only the relentless circling of his thoughts like coyotes in the dark. He had spent years thinking of himself as a man apart, carving out a quiet life in dust and sweat, bound to no one but his cattle and his own solitude. Yet now that illusion had shattered with a crust of bread and a swallow of water, and the weight of what it had birthed bore down upon him until his chest ached with the strain. If he turned them away, the boy, the elder, the 400 who waited with painted faces and patient drums, he knew well enough what would follow. For hunger and grief were sharp spurs, and rejection would be read not as distance but as betrayal. The fragile bond forged by mercy broken and answered with fire. His ranch burned, his life ended, and perhaps worse, the blood of war spilling across the frontier in a tide that would wash away not just him but every settler and homestead caught in the storm. Yet if he accepted, if he allowed their claim upon him to stand, he would be stepping into a role he had never sought, becoming not a rancher but a symbol, the bridge between worlds that did not wish to meet, and for that the settlers would never forgive him. They would call him traitor, would brand his name in their whispers as outlaw, and he would be hunted by his own kind, his every step marked by suspicion, his every sunrise shadowed by the threat of their rifles. The weight of choice ground against him until his shoulders sagged beneath it, and he thought of the boy again, once crouched fragile and starving in the dust, now sitting with pride upon his painted pony, and he saw not just hunger and survival but the shadow of his own youth. The night a stranger's hand had reached into his emptiness and given him life, a memory that had shaped him even as he buried it, and he wondered if all of this, every step, every breath had been leading him back to this reckoning, this mirror where his mercy would demand its price. The barn loomed silent as he passed it again and again, cattle shifting uneasily within, as if they too felt the tremor of what was to come. And in their restless movement, he heard the echo of the drum still pulsing faintly across the plains. Steady as the heart of the army waiting for him to speak, he rubbed a hand across his face, eyes burning with exhaustion, but still he walked, under stars that gave no counsel, under a sky vast enough to make his struggle feel small, and yet merciless enough to remind him that his choice would ripple across more than his own life. The night stretched long, a corridor of silence broken only by his footsteps, and though he begged the darkness for an answer, none came. Only the truth he already knew clawing at him like a wound. Whichever path he chose, there would be no turning back, and when dawn came again, the man who stepped out onto the porch would no longer be the same cowboy who had shared bread with a starving boy, but someone remade by mercy, hunted by fate, bound to a fire that no night could put out. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, washing the plains in a pale gold that caught the edges of every rifle barrel, every painted face, every restless mane as the 400 riders stood arrayed in solemn silence, their formation as unbroken as a wall of stone, the steady breath of their horses clouding in the morning chill like smoke rising from an unseen fire. And as the cowboy stepped out onto his porch, boots striking against the boards that seemed to echo louder than any drum, the air itself grew brittle, stretched thin as though it might crack under the weight of what hung in it. He carried no rifle this time, though its absence felt like the ache of a missing limb. Instead he walked with empty hands, a choice he knew they would read, for in this moment every gesture was as sharp as any word, and he forced his shoulders to stay square, even as his heart hammered like a runaway horse in his chest. The boy was there, seated once more atop his painted pony at the elder's side, his small frame rigid, his eyes burning with the same fire that had haunted the cowboy's sleep, a gaze that dared him to speak truth, to step fully into the bond he had forged with bread and water. And the elder's presence was as steady as the earth itself, his weathered face unreadable, carrying not threat but the unyielding certainty of judgment. The cowboy felt the silence press against him until his throat dried, until his tongue seemed heavy as stone. And he knew that the next sound from his mouth, the next word to pass his lips, would not merely be his own but would ripple across every man here, across every settlement watching from the edge of rumor, across the frontier itself, carried in memory as either the birth of fragile peace or the spark of war. He thought of the sheriff in town, eyes glinting with greed, muttering of fire he could not put out, and he knew that choosing to stand with the riders meant carving his name away from the world he had known, meant branding himself outlaw in the eyes of his kind. But he also thought of the boy crouched in the dust, ribs sharp as knives beneath skin, and the stranger who had once saved him in his own hunger, and he understood at last that mercy had always been a chain, one link to another, stretching across years and blood, binding men not by law but by survival. His chest rose with a deep breath that felt like his last as a free man and his first as something more. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low but clear enough to cut the silence, carrying not defiance nor apology but resolve. "I will not turn him away." The words seemed to hang, suspended before sinking into the sea of riders, and for a heartbeat there was no sound, only the thrum of his pulse in his ears, until the elder lifted his hand, a gesture that rippled through the gathered men like wind through tall grass, a murmur rising not of anger but of acknowledgement, and the boy's gaze softened, pride and relief flickering like flame. The cowboy knew then that his choice had bound him forever, that the frontier would not forget, and whether history named him savior or traitor no longer mattered. For in this fragile dawn, with the weight of 400 eyes upon him, he had chosen mercy, and mercy was the fire that would burn in memory long after his name was dust.